The history of the penal systems in Mexico and Sweden follows paths that diverge drastically. While Mexico was shaped by centuries of repression and harsh punishments, Sweden built its model around a mentality of reparation and rehabilitation. Since ancient times, Mexico has viewed punishment as a form of social control, where exclusion and isolation were the responses to those who broke the rules. In contrast, Sweden has evolved its vision, adopting a system that values reclaiming dignity. These very different paths have planted deep roots in today's societies. Click like and subscribe to the channel. It will only take a second, and you will help us a lot. In Sweden, the political changes of the 20th century reinforce the idea that justice should not only punish, but also rehabilitate. They transformed the system to give citizens a second chance, investing in policies so that inmates return better than when they entered. In Mexico, despite attempts at reform, the culture of punishment persists, and overcrowding has become part of prison reality. This historical difference helps to explain how prisons in these countries reflect such opposing values, as if they were mirrors of a society that still bears the traces of its past. Interestingly, Sweden sees crime as an opportunity to understand society's flaws and thus correct course. It is as if each crime was a warning, a call for social and political action. In Mexico, the historical view still sees crime as an individual failure, a character issue that deserves isolation. These deep and deep-rooted differences reveal the weight of culture and history in the way each country deals with the penal system. And how can this scenario be changed if these ideas are so deeply rooted? Still, the question arises, will it be possible for Mexico to build a vision as transformative as Sweden's? History may be strong, but the present is always a chance to create something new. Who knows what the future might bring when you understand the past? In Mexico, prison overcrowding is not an isolated phenomenon, but an intricate web of causes that feed on each other. The lack of opportunities, coupled with social inequality, creates an environment in which crime becomes almost an inevitable route for many. This overload in prisons goes beyond physical space. It reflects a society where justice is often seen as inaccessible to those who need it most. In each crowded cell, we see a curiosity about countries where the system works better and a latent question: what makes the Mexican reality so different? The consequences of this problem are visible not only for inmates, but for society as a whole. Prisoners who could be rehabilitated end up falling deeper into a cycle of violence, while families outside the walls suffer from loss and stigma. The economic impact is also heavy. Maintaining an overcrowded prison system consumes resources that could be invested in prevention and education. It's like trying to heal a wound without ever treating the cause. The infection continues to spread, becoming more and more resistant. This situation creates a snowball. The increase in crime demands more prisons, which in turn quickly become overcrowded, increasing the dissatisfaction and despair of those inside. This vicious cycle can only be broken with a change of perspective, one that looks beyond the bars. When we look at the curiosity of a country like Sweden, we realize that overcrowding is more than a space problem. It is a problem of structure and values. And so, a question hangs in the air. What does Mexico need to transform its system and offer every citizen a real chance for change? Perhaps the answer lies not just in the cells, but in the roots of this cycle that seems unbreakable. And by understanding these causes and consequences, it is possible to see that alternatives exist. They just need to be sought. Sweden has found a way of dealing with crime that seems almost contradictory to many nations. There, the focus is not just to punish, but to transform. Instead of seeing incarceration as an end, Swedes see it as an opportunity to reintegrate the citizen. The Swedish penal system focuses on rehabilitation and resocialization, where the convicted person is encouraged to reflect, learn, and rebuild their lives. This progressive vision makes curiosity about countries like Sweden even more intriguing because instead of full cells, we see spaces dedicated to personal growth. For them, crime is not just a transgression, but a sign that something needs to be adjusted in society. Therefore, the penal system not only locks the individual away, but also offers psychological support, education programs, and even employment activities that prepare them for a productive life after prison. This approach prevents recurrence, as many leave ready to start again and not to repeat mistakes. In Mexico, where crowded prisons create a cycle of despair, this practice sounds almost like a utopia. In Sweden, the issue is not how many prisons they build, but how they avoid building them. Instead of spending on more cells, the Swedish government invests in social policies, crime prevention, and support for those who need it most. Thus, the need to imprison is reduced, and the capacity to transform is increased. This philosophy goes against the grain in many countries where incarceration is seen as the only answer. The curious thing is that this vision seems to bear fruit. Less crime, fewer prisons, more citizenship. And here comes the question: could Mexico adopt similar practices? Or does social and cultural reality require a different approach? When we look at this contrast, it becomes clear that the Swedish solution is an invitation to reflection for those seeking an alternative to overcrowding and marginalization. The vision of justice is a deep reflection of the cultural roots of each nation. In Mexico, the concept of justice still carries the weight of a punitive legacy, where crime is seen as a moral failure that deserves severity. In Sweden, the understanding is almost the opposite. Crime is treated as a symptom of something that can be corrected, and incarceration is the last option. This cultural difference shapes the way each country deals with offenders, and opens up curiosity about countries where justice seeks not only to punish, but also to cure. In Mexico, the idea of justice is closely linked to the notion of punishment and exclusion. It is as if society wanted to purify those who made mistakes, removing them from social life. In Sweden, the vision is one of inclusion and recovery, where a citizen's mistake is treated as an opportunity for society to ask itself where it went wrong. This contrast makes us reflect on how values and beliefs can directly impact the functioning of the penal system, and even the number of people in each cell. Cultural differences are also reflected in the expectations that each society has of its penal system. In Mexico, many believe that long sentences and crowded cells are the way to reduce crime. In Sweden, however, the aim is to reintegrate, not overwhelm. This focus on rehabilitation and education creates a society more willing to see prisoners as someone capable of change. The country's curiosity is aroused. Could Mexico adopt such a transformative approach? And so the question arises, to what extent can culture be transformed to embrace a more humane and inclusive vision of justice? It is a complex dilemma, which requires deep reflection on the foundations of society and the role of the penal system as an agent of true change. Education and poverty are powerful forces that shape destinies, and in Mexico, their impact on the prison system is profound. The lack of educational opportunities creates a narrow path for many young people, where crime, however frightening it may seem, becomes an almost inevitable exit. While in some countries the educational system acts as a bridge to the future, in Mexico, it often fails to offer this alternative. This leads us to a curiosity about countries that use education as a crime prevention tool, preventing so many lives from being drawn into the criminal system. Poverty is the invisible hand that pushes many into the abyss, especially in communities where access to basic goods and dignity are a distant luxury. The vulnerability created by poverty is fertile ground for marginalization, fueling the statistics of overcrowding in Mexican prisons. Many young people, with no other way out, fall into the traps of crime and end up trapped not only physically, but also in a cycle that perpetuates poverty and helplessness. It is as if the prison system were an inevitable consequence of this lack of opportunities. In Sweden, education and social policies are used as preventive barriers, ensuring that few are forced to turn to crime to survive. By investing in citizen training and supporting the most vulnerable families, Sweden is able to create an environment where crime is less tempting. This contrast leads us to wonder, how could Mexico build an educational system that rescues rather than abandons? Because, in the end, it is the absence of perspectives that turns prison into a possibility. And so, the question remains, can Mexico break this cycle where poverty and lack of education become gateways to the prison system? With a structure that supports, educates, and inspires, perhaps the country can open new paths for its people and leave the burden of overcrowding behind. Investing in a prison system is not just about building more cells, it's about transforming the purpose of these structures. In Sweden, resources are directed so that each prison is a rehabilitation space where the inmate finds psychological support, education, and guidance for life outside bars. Instead of spending to keep prisoners locked up, the Swedish government uses its investments to ensure that people return to society prepared as renewed citizens. This curiosity about countries that see incarceration as a chance for a fresh start provokes reflection. What would happen to Mexico if it followed a similar path? Mexico, on the other hand, faces difficulties in investing effectively in the prison system, often focusing only on the physical expansion of prisons. The deteriorated infrastructure and lack of rehabilitation programs reflect a reality where prisoners do not have the opportunity for change. Without this prospect of recovery, Mexican prisons end up becoming warehouses for people, where the chance for a new beginning is rare. It's like investing in a wheel that spins in place. More people enter, but few manage to leave transformed. The effect of a focused investment in rehabilitation is notable in Sweden, where recidivism rates are low and society feels safer. This happens because the Swedish system not only deals with the prisoner's behavior, but also with the causes that led him to the crime. This contrast highlights a failure in Mexico, where resources seem insufficient or poorly applied. Imagine if Mexican investment were redirected to education and training within prisons. The impact would be transformative. So, the question that remains is, how much is Mexico willing to invest to truly transform lives? Perhaps the answer lies not in increasing the number of prisons, but in creating opportunities within them. With the right focus, each investment can be a step towards making overcrowding just a memory of the past. Drug policies in Mexico have an immense impact on prison overcrowding, creating a cycle where minor crimes end up resulting in long prison sentences. The war on drugs, although well-intentioned, sends thousands to prison for crimes related to drug trafficking and consumption, without considering that, for many, this is a route forced by the lack of opportunities. While Mexico takes a punitive approach, curiosity about countries like Sweden raises questions about less harsh alternatives, where treatment replaces incarceration in cases of possession and consumption. In Sweden, drugs are treated differently. Instead of seeing the user as a criminal, the system considers him a person in need. As a result, resources are focused on treatments and rehabilitation programs, avoiding the incarceration of those who are on the margins, but who can still be recovered. This approach reduces pressure on prisons and, at the same time, protects society, preventing people with petty crimes from being drawn into a system that only reinforces marginalization. In Mexico, however, each inmate represents another piece in the tangled problem of overcrowding. This difference in approach creates a domino effect. While Sweden is investing in reintegration programs, Mexico is investing in prisons to contain the growing wave of minor crimes. It's a striking contrast. In Sweden, the focus is on rescue. In Mexico, it's on punishment. Imagine the impact if resources invested in prisons were redirected to public health policies that treat addiction. Curiosity about countries that invest in rehabilitation leads us to question whether Mexico is prepared for such a profound change. So the question remains, what if Mexico rethought its drug policies? Would we see fewer crowded prisons and more stories of transformation? The answer may not be simple, but the Swedish experience shows us that another path is possible. The way a country treats nonviolent crimes reveals a lot about its vision of justice. In Mexico, even minor offenses can result in long prison sentences, which directly contributes to overcrowding in jails. Petty theft, drug possession, and other nonviolent crimes drive people into a system that often pushes them further into marginalization. On the other hand, there is curiosity about countries like Sweden, where rehabilitation and alternatives to prison are recurring options for less serious crimes, offering a second chance for these people to reintegrate into society. In Sweden, the approach is quite different. Non-violent crimes are seen as opportunities for correction and learning, not immediate imprisonment. Instead of incarcerating, the Swedish system promotes community work programs, counseling, and even educational measures, aiming to correct behavior without completely breaking the link with society. The effect of this is visible in the recidivism statistics, which are low, as many of those who commit petty crimes do not end up in the prison system. In Mexico, this reality sounds distant, but at the same time inspiring. Imagine if Mexico followed a similar model, where justice, instead of applying relentless punishment, could give the offender a real chance to start over. After all, a person who makes a nonviolent mistake does not necessarily need to be treated as a potential criminal. By creating alternatives, such as rehabilitation and social support programs, the system could prevent people with minor crimes from becoming repeat offenders. It is a vision that, in addition to relieving prisons, would bring a new dynamic to society. And so, we might ask ourselves, what prevents Mexico from adopting a more flexible and transformative approach to nonviolent crimes? The answer may lie in a change of mentality, one that sees the offender as someone capable of evolving and not just another number in overcrowded cells. The judicial system is the foundation of any criminal system, but in Mexico, it faces barriers that make justice a slow and flawed process. Bureaucracy, lack of resources, and the volume of cases overload the system, resulting in a scenario where many prisoners wait for trial for long periods, sometimes longer than the sentence they would receive. This delay fuels overcrowding and raises curiosity about countries that have managed to optimize their judicial structures, such as Sweden, where justice is agile and accessible to all. In Sweden, the judicial process is efficient, with reduced deadlines and greater access to public defense. The Swedish structure works to ensure that the trial is quick and fair, avoiding unnecessary incarceration and prolonged stay of people in prisons. In Mexico, this agility is still a distant dream, where justice often arrives too late. This comparison makes us think about the impact that a functioning judicial system could have in a country where prisons are overcrowded, like a missing link that still needs to be found. For many Mexicans, waiting for trial is almost an extra sentence. Without judicial reform that speeds up the process, overcrowding will continue to snowball. Imagine the difference it would make if there was a greater commitment to reducing bureaucracy and ensuring access to fair and quick defense. The curiosity of a country that has already achieved these advances, such as Sweden, serves as an inspiration for those who believe in a system where justice does not have to wait. And so, the reflection arises. Is Mexico ready to face the urgent need to reform its judicial system? Perhaps true justice lies in providing not only a fair trial, but also in ensuring that it occurs on time, preventing the burden of waiting from becoming yet another punishment. In Sweden, the idea of rehabilitation goes beyond simply serving a sentence. The Swedish penal system views each inmate as someone with potential for change, and the focus is on giving these people the tools to reintegrate into society. Education programs, psychological guidance, and even professional training are part of everyday life in Swedish prisons, where the objective is not just to punish, but to transform. This approach generates curiosity about countries that invest in resocialization as a way to prevent crime, a strategy that many still consider bold. The impact of this philosophy is visible. The recidivism rate in Sweden is low, as many ex-offenders are able to start over and build a dignified life after serving their sentences. For them, prison was a turning point, not a dead end. This model contrasts with the Mexican reality, where rehabilitation is still a distant promise. When seeing Swedish practices, the reflection intensifies. What would happen if Mexico adopted such a humanized approach? Could the country see a significant reduction in the return to crime? In Mexico, the lack of investment in rehabilitation programs is one of the reasons why many inmates end up returning to the penal system. Without psychological support, without learning opportunities, many leave prisons with few options other than the path that led them there. The curiosity of a country like Sweden teaches us that reintegration is possible, but it requires commitment and a vision for the future. It's a matter of building bridges, not walls. So, the question remains, is Mexico willing to invest in transforming lives and not just in building more cells? Because, in the end, rehabilitation is a path that benefits not only the individual, but the entire society that welcomes them back. When it comes to human rights, the difference between the Swedish and Mexican prison systems is almost abysmal. In Sweden, prisons are designed to respect the dignity of each person, regardless of their past or crimes. Each cell is a space with light, ventilation, and even areas for recreational activities, promoting an environment that, far from aggravating, seeks to calm the prisoner's mind. In Mexico, the reality is different. Overcrowded cells, unsanitary conditions, and a daily life marked by violence and despair, which question the very concept of human rights within these walls. In Sweden, dignity is not a privilege, but a guaranteed right. This generates curiosity about countries that see prisoners as someone who, despite their mistakes, is still part of society and deserves humane treatment. This respect reduces stress and, ironically, promotes safety within prisons, as less hostile environments generate fewer conflicts. In Mexico, where the situation is much darker, we see a system that seems to push prisoners towards dehumanization, often worsening the psychological and emotional situation of those who will one day need to return to social life. Imagine the impact if Mexico adopted a model where respect for people was central, regardless of their flaws. Improving prison conditions could represent not only a change of scenery, but also an opening for human rights to truly prevail. It would be a way of reaffirming the human value of each prisoner and, at the same time, taking a step towards reducing recidivism. When observing these Swedish practices, it becomes clear how dignified treatment can transform not only the prisoner, but also society. Thus, the question that arises is inevitable. Is Mexico prepared to see its inmates as individuals who deserve a second chance and humane treatment? This question resonates strongly, and the answer, although complex, can be the first step towards real change. The psychological impact of being imprisoned can be devastating, but this experience varies drastically between Mexico and Sweden. In Mexico, conditions of overcrowding and violence create an environment of constant tension where each day in prison is a battle for survival. This scenario profoundly affects the mental health of inmates, leaving emotional scars that often stay with them for the rest of their lives. In Sweden, the focus on the well-being of prisoners promotes a healthier recovery, offering a space where they can reflect and learn instead of just surviving. The difference becomes even more evident when we look at how psychological support is treated. In Sweden, psychological assistance is part of the criminal justice system and is accessible to those facing emotional difficulties. The safe and organized environment helps reduce stress and crises, while in Mexico, the lack of psychological support deepens trauma, creating individuals who leave more disturbed than they entered. This curiosity about countries that treat mental health as a priority within prisons leads us to question what Mexico could do to offer a less exhausting experience. The Swedish experience teaches us that by caring for prisoners' minds and emotions, the system reduces the risk of recidivism, as many leave prison emotionally balanced and ready for a new life. In Mexico, this possibility seems distant, but it is not impossible. Imagine if every prisoner could receive psychological support during their sentence, with sessions that help them deal with trauma and reconnect with their own humanity. This kind of support would be revolutionary in a system that still neglects mental health. And so, the question remains, could Mexico see a transformation in its prison system by paying more attention to the psychological impact of prison? Perhaps the first step is recognizing that the true value of a sentence lies in the change it can promote, both in the body and in the mind. Family and community support is an essential pillar for the reintegration of anyone who has been through the prison system. In Sweden, the family is seen as an important link in the rehabilitation process, and prison policies facilitate the maintenance of these bonds. Regular visits, support programs, and even group activities help prisoners stay connected to their families and remember what awaits them on the outside. In Mexico, this reality is very different. Many inmates lose contact with their families, which makes their reintegration even more difficult once they are released. The community in Sweden also plays an active role, with programs that encourage the acceptance and social reintegration of ex-offenders. Swedish society understands that supporting someone who has served their sentence is an important step towards reducing crime and strengthening social ties. In Mexico, however, the stigma of ex-convicts is an obstacle that many cannot overcome. The lack of opportunities and family isolation end up pushing these people into a cycle of marginalization. Curiosity about countries where the community welcomes former inmates leads us to think about how Mexico could transform this reality. Imagine if there were a program in Mexico that encouraged families to visit and support their imprisoned relatives, as well as activities that involved the community in the reintegration process. This change could create an environment of hope and welcome, where the prisoner, upon leaving, would feel part of something bigger, something that would drive him to seek a dignified life. It is a path that requires commitment, but can reduce recidivism and make society safer. So the question arises, is Mexico willing to strengthen these essential ties to guarantee a successful reintegration? Perhaps the first step is to see the prisoner not as a number, but as someone who, with the right support, can return to being an active and positive member of the community. In Sweden, the prison system goes beyond the bars, offering employment and education programs that prepare prisoners for life in freedom. Each prisoner has the chance to learn a profession, complete studies, and even participate in training that strengthens their skills. These programs help transform prison into an environment of growth, not just punishment. In Mexico, this reality is a distant dream for many inmates who face a routine of idleness and lack of stimulation. Curiosity about countries that value training in prisons sparks reflection. What could Mexico do to follow this path? These Swedish training programs range from job workshops to academic courses, allowing the inmate to leave prison with something more than a debt to society. He gains a personal transformation tool, something that makes him capable of starting over. In Mexico, the lack of productive activities in prisons only reinforces the marginalization of inmates, who rarely have the chance to acquire new skills. Thus, prison becomes a vicious cycle, where the lack of preparation for life outside bars makes reintegration even more difficult. Imagine if Mexican prisons could offer technical courses, crafts workshops, and even university programs. Each day of learning would represent progress for those who will one day leave the prison system. In addition to contributing to the prisoner's personal recovery, these initiatives would reduce recidivism and strengthen the social fabric. The curiosity of a country that invests in education as a tool for transformation leads us to think about possibilities that are still unexplored. So, the question remains, is Mexico ready to invest in human potential within prisons? This is the type of investment that brings lasting results, not only for the prisoner, but for the entire society that welcomes him back. Sweden has found innovative alternatives to prison, especially for minor crimes, making incarceration a last option. Instead of automatically depriving anyone who makes a mistake of their freedom, the Swedish system seeks alternatives such as community service, fines, and rehabilitation programs. These options not only relieve the prison system, but also allow the individual to pay their debt to society in a constructive way. In Mexico, where incarceration is widely used for any infraction, curiosity about countries that apply more humane alternatives leads us to reflect on the benefits of less punitive justice. These alternatives are based on the idea that not every crime deserves the same punishment. Sweden understands that for nonviolent crimes, there are more effective ways to prevent reoffending without the need for prison. Instead of transforming prison into a certain destiny, the system offers offenders the chance to continue in society, taking responsibility for their actions. The contrast with Mexico is evident, where the lack of alternatives ends up filling prisons with people who could serve sentences in a less harmful way. Imagine the impact in Mexico if there were more flexible alternatives, such as community work or treatment programs for those who commit minor crimes. Instead of spending public resources on more cells and infrastructure, Mexico could invest in programs that encourage behavior change. This curiosity of a country that adopts alternatives to incarceration makes us question the Mexican model and think about how it could change. And so the question arises, to what extent is Mexico prepared to give up harsh punishments in favor of more humane alternatives? The answer may lie in recognizing that justice does not necessarily mean imprisonment, but rather offering a real chance of correction and reintegration. Returning to society after serving a sentence is an immense challenge, especially when the ex-convict carries the weight of stigma. In Mexico, this brand is almost an additional sentence, with doors closed at every corner, from the job market to personal relationships. Many face prejudice and distrust, as if the past can never be left behind. In contrast, in Sweden, ex-prisoner reintegration is seen as a collective responsibility, and society is encouraged to welcome and offer a new chance. This contrast awakens curiosity about countries that deal with stigma in a more welcoming way. In Sweden, there are specific programs that facilitate the entry of ex-offenders into the job market and even incentives for companies that hire these people. The logic is simple. By offering an opportunity to start over, the country reduces recidivism and strengthens social ties. In Mexico, however, ex-prisoners face an almost insurmountable barrier, often being pushed back into crime due to a lack of alternatives. This reality reinforces the cycle of marginalization, where each new mistake seems to be the only option for those who do not find acceptance. Imagine the positive impact of a program that encouraged Mexican businesses and communities to welcome ex-convicts. This practice would not only change lives, but also strengthen security, reducing the return to crime. A system that offers opportunities and not just judgment proves to be more humane and efficient. Curiosity about countries that seek the complete reintegration of ex-prisoners leads us to question: could Mexico adopt this approach and see society as a whole benefit? The question that arises then is to what extent Mexico is prepared to change this punitive mentality and embrace reintegration as a value. Perhaps the first step is to see the ex-convict not as a risk, but as someone ready to start over, with support and dignity. The war on crime in Mexico is a constant battle, but its effects on the prison system are alarming. With severe repressive policies, the country faces an exponential increase in incarcerations, treating crime as an enemy to be eliminated without considering the deep roots that fuel it. This approach, despite seeming necessary at first, results in a prison system that is overflowing, unable to offer dignified conditions or rehabilitation. In countries like Sweden, where the focus is on prevention and the causes of crime, curiosity arises about how a less punitive and more preventive approach could transform the Mexican reality. In Sweden, fighting crime is not just about punishment. It involves social policies, education, and growth opportunities for young people in vulnerable situations. The idea is to attack the problem at its root, preventing crime from becoming an attractive option. In Mexico, the lack of prevention programs creates a cycle where punishment is the only recourse, increasing the number of prisoners and depleting the system's capacity. This contrast makes us wonder, what if Mexico focused its resources on creating opportunities and inclusion policies? For the average Mexican, the idea of preventing crime rather than punishing it may seem distant, but the results in Sweden show how effective this approach is. By investing in prevention, the need for punishment is reduced, which frees up prisons and strengthens the social fabric. Imagine the impact if, instead of building more cells, Mexico built schools, support centers, and programs for at-risk youth. This curiosity about countries that see crime as a social problem and not just a criminal one leads us to rethink the current path. The question that remains is Mexico prepared to abandon the war on crime as we know it and adopt a strategy of prevention and inclusion? Perhaps, by putting aside the incessant fighting, the country will find a more lasting and efficient way to guarantee security and peace. The role of the police system is crucial to the functioning of prisons, especially in Mexico, where the strict police approach often directly contributes to overcrowding. The lack of adequate training and humanized protocols means that arrests are more frequent and less selective, leading to the incarceration of people who, in many cases, could be sent to alternative programs. In Sweden, the reality is different. The police are trained to deal with situations preventively and with a focus on rehabilitation, which reduces the need for massive arrests. This curiosity about countries that apply a more humanized policing approach leads us to question, could Mexico learn from this experience? In Sweden, police officers take a more active role in crime prevention, focusing on resolving conflicts before they turn into irreversible situations. The training emphasizes mediation and peaceful resolution, preventing minor cases from reaching the prison system. This contrast with Mexico, where the approach is often more punitive, highlights the impact that humanized police action can have. Instead of simply filling jails, the Swedish police work to keep society stable and safe, avoiding the criminalization of situations that could be resolved otherwise. Imagine the effect in Mexico if there was a greater focus on police training aimed at mediation and dialogue. Instead of always resorting to detention, the police could be a bridge to alternatives that avoid incarceration. This practice would reduce pressure on the prison system and open space for a more efficient and inclusive public security model. Curiosity about countries that apply this type of policing leads us to consider how Mexico could evolve. So the question arises, is Mexico ready to rethink the role of its police and embrace a model where security goes beyond prisons? Perhaps this change is the initial step towards a society where justice begins long before it reaches the cells. Thinking about the future of prison overcrowding in Mexico requires courage to recognize what needs to change and vision to build a better system. The current scenario may seem desperate, but the solution is within reach. When looking at countries like Sweden, it is clear that change does not happen overnight, but it is possible. Reforming the system doesn't just mean building new prisons. It is necessary to rethink each stage of the process, from prevention to reintegration. This curiosity about countries that have managed to control their prison populations inspires us to reflect. What does Mexico really need to change? Investments in rehabilitation programs, education, and alternatives to incarceration are crucial steps. In Sweden, these initiatives have already shown that by investing in human beings, society as a whole reaps the benefits. Mexico, by redirecting resources to these areas, can begin to see results that transcend prison walls. Imagine the impact of a generation that grows up with access to education, away from cells and close to work and development opportunities. Change also begins in public policies. By adopting judicial and penal reforms, Mexico can reduce incarceration for minor crimes and focus on rehabilitation for offenders who still have a chance of recovery. This new approach would allow society to begin to see the criminal system as an ally in building a fairer and safer future. Countries like Sweden show us that justice can be restorative and that punishment is not the only way. So, the question remains, is Mexico willing to make the necessary investments and changes to end overcrowding? Perhaps the first step is to believe that yes, another future is possible. One where prisons are not the inevitable fate, but the last alternative. Looking around the world, we see that Mexico is not alone in the fight against prison overcrowding. Several countries faced similar challenges and, through innovative reforms, managed to transform their prison systems. In Norway, for example, prisons have been redesigned to provide a rehabilitative environment, with cells that are more reminiscent of a home than a conventional cell. This less hostile environment promotes recovery and reduces recidivism. Curiosity about countries that have implemented such radical changes makes us question, could Mexico be inspired by such models? Another inspiring example comes from the Netherlands, which adopted policies to decriminalize certain crimes and alternatives to incarceration for minor crimes. This approach allowed for a significant reduction in the prison population, to the point where the country closed several prisons. Meanwhile, Mexico continues to build new units without being able to solve the overcrowding problem. Imagining a reality where prisons are not necessary on a large scale leads us to reflect on what would be possible with a change in perspective and well-structured policies. In Japan, penal reforms focused on post-prison support, helping ex-offenders reintegrate into society through employment and psychological counseling programs. This measure ensures that the person not only leaves prison, but also finds support to rebuild their life. In Mexico, where the stigma of ex-prisoners is still a major obstacle, the Japanese example raises hope for a system where reintegration becomes a fundamental part of justice. The question that arises then is Mexico prepared to adopt models that place rehabilitation at the center of penal policies? As we look at these reforms around the world, we see that the future of the Mexican prison system can be transformed. The answer lies in embracing these possibilities and reimagining the role of prisons in society. Prison overcrowding in Mexico has a cost that goes far beyond the prison walls. In economic terms, maintaining a swollen prison population consumes an enormous amount of public resources, which could be directed to education, health, and social programs. Each crowded cell represents a recurring expense for the government, which needs to cover everything from food to security. In contrast, countries like Sweden invest these resources in prevention and rehabilitation, spending less in the long term and creating a safer society. This curiosity about countries that optimize the use of public resources leads us to rethink the current model. The social impact is equally significant. Overcrowding has a domino effect, harming both inmates and their families and communities. The absence of a father, mother, or child is felt intensely, leaving deep marks and affecting even the next generation. Many families in Mexico, without support to deal with the absence of their loved ones, face economic and emotional challenges that perpetuate the cycle of marginalization. Imagine the impact of a system that, instead of destroying bonds, promoted recovery and reintegration. Furthermore, the stigma faced by ex-prisoners prevents many from rebuilding their lives, increasing the chance of recidivism and creating a cycle that seems unbreakable. Society pays not just in money, but in lost opportunities for reintegration and rehabilitation. This reality makes the contrast with countries where the prison system seeks to reintegrate, not distance, even more evident. In Mexico, each new prisoner is a cost that echoes throughout society. The inevitable question is, how much more is Mexico willing to spend on overcrowding before considering reform? Perhaps it is time to reevaluate priorities and see justice as an investment, where every dollar invested in recovery and prevention is worth more than dozens spent on prisons.
Hey explorers, if you love discovering the amazing curiosities and stories we share here on Exploring Nations, how about supporting the channel with just $1? This small gesture can make a big difference and is essential to keep this content going. Without your support, our journey might be cut short. And there's more. When you shop on Amazon, use our special link. It costs you nothing extra, plus you get an exclusive discount and it helps us out a lot. The links for donations and Amazon are pinned in the first comment. Don't let this adventure stop, we're counting on you. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and drop us a comment.